Hi, this is the video for Daf Shevui, Daf Nun Het of Masechet Ketubot. I am, as always, Joshua Kulp from the Conservative Yeshiva. And I wanted to go over a little bit of the Mishnah on the second half of Nun Het, and compare it a little bit with what I spoke about last week about how the Mishnah expresses law. Last week we talked about Truma and the fact that only Kohanim can eat Truma, or the members of their household, and therefore when the Mishnah wants to delineate who is married and who is not, one way of doing it is to say a woman betrothed or married to a Kohen can eat Truma. In other words, that's a way of saying, for instance, betrothal is really in many ways, or in essence, equivalent to marriage, and therefore a woman who's betrothed can eat Truma. And that is the way they express that law, even if they're not particularly concerned with the reality of who gets to eat Truma. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, and maybe I should express this a little better one more time, the Mishnah doesn't say things like, a woman is married upon betrothal. That's just not the way the Mishnah talks. The Mishnah will speak in consequences, saying a woman betrothed may eat Truma or may not eat Truma, and that is the way that the Mishnah and really the rabbis in general express laws, by pointing out the consequences. Another way of doing this, and we see this frequently throughout rabbinic literature, is the issue of hekdesh. Hekdesh is the ability that somebody has to dedicate something or its value to the temple. Now, we all know that by the Mishnah's time, and certainly later on in the period, the temple was no longer standing in Jerusalem, and the ability of somebody, or the practicality of somebody actually dedicating something to the temple seems to be, of very little practical significance. I would argue that people just weren't doing that back then, and if you did, then there was basically nothing you could do with it anyway, because there was no temple. So why then does the Mishnah continue to talk about hekdesh, dedicating something to the temple, especially in the realm of marital law, which is often quite practical? Most of this Mishnah is practical. So I would say to you, the Mishnah says, look, let's read again the Mishnah. Hamakdish ma'aseh yadei ishto. Somebody who dedicates his wife's handiwork. Harei zo osa ve'ochelet. She can continue to work and consume, that's what she works. I would say that what the Mishnah is trying to say is the husband doesn't really have ownership over the work that his wife produces. In other words, the work that his wife produces is hers, and he can't dedicate it to the temple. Now, in a normal relationship, he's providing her a guaranteed sustenance, and she in return would give over to him her handiwork. The same way that it works, I would say, in most more modern working relationships. I go out to buy the food, my wife is working. No one says, "Oh, you're buying the food, it's her food." We don't think that way, right? We just think in general, people work, they can contribute to the overall pot, and then people take out what they need. My wife's handiwork is not hers, it's not mine, it's basically ours. I would say to a certain extent it's similar in the Mishnaic times. A husband does not own his wife. He doesn't own her handiwork. It's hers. When he gives her food, she, of either norm or really of necessity, would all have to give back. And if she were to say, look, I'm not giving you my stuff, then she wouldn't have a right to ask for food or sustenance at the same time, right? That would be unfair. But his obligation to her is absolute. In return, he gives her things, but it doesn't mean that he owns them. And that's what the Mishnah is trying to say, is expressing it, as often the Mishnah does, in a very abstract manner, an unrealistic manner, but points out the consequences. When you don't own something, even if you try to dedicate it to the temple, the dedication is not effective. And that's what this Mishnah does. It doesn't just say, like, a husband doesn't have a right to his wife's handiwork. What it's saying is, if he tries to exercise his absolute right over it, that exercise of his right is not valid. And that's the something you should look forward to, look to in many Mishnayot, which express halacha in terms of consequences and not in terms of rules.